Look at a map of the American Southwest, and something strange jumps out. In the middle of Arizona, there's a nearly circular patch of land, about 2.5 million acres, that belongs to one nation. And wrapped completely around it, on every single side, is another nation's territory. No shared border with the outside world. No highway that leads there without first crossing someone else's land. This is the Hopi Reservation, and it sits like an island, entirely enclosed within the Navajo Nation. To understand how strange this actually is, you have to understand what a reservation normally looks like. Most Native American reservations touch state lines, other reservations, or open public land in multiple directions. They have edges that connect to the wider world in more than one place. The Hopi Reservation doesn't. If you trace its boundary with your finger, you never leave Navajo land until you're back where you started. It is, essentially, a landlocked nation within a nation within a nation, the United States surrounding the Navajo Nation, and the Navajo Nation surrounding the Hopi. This didn't happen by accident, and it didn't happen because two peoples decided to live like this. It happened because of over a century of shifting federal policy, broken promises, and two very different histories colliding in the same desert. Let's start with who was there first, because that matters a lot here. The Hopi people have lived in this region for over 1,000 years. Their villages, especially places like Old Orabi, are among the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in North America. The Hopi were farmers. They grew corn, beans, and squash in one of the driest, harshest environments imaginable, using dry farming techniques passed down for generations. Their way of life was deeply tied to specific mesas, specific villages, specific pieces of land that carried ceremonial and spiritual meaning. This wasn't a nomadic culture moving across a wide territory. It was a settled culture rooted in a compact area of northeastern Arizona. The Navajo, or Dine, as they call themselves, arrived in the Southwest later, likely migrating from the north sometime between the 1200s and 1500s. Over time, the Navajo developed a different relationship with land. Traditionally more pastoral, herding sheep and goats across wide stretches of territory, the Navajo way of life required much more physical space to sustain flocks and move with the seasons. Two different peoples, two different economies, two different relationships with the same general region. For a long time, these differences existed without a hard boundary problem, because there wasn't a hard boundary at all. Land use overlapped in complicated, informal ways, as it often does among peoples who've lived near each other for centuries. The real trouble started when the United States government got involved and decided that these fluid, complicated relationships needed to be turned into fixed lines on a map. In 1868, the U.S. government signed a treaty with the Navajo, establishing a reservation for them following the brutal Long Walk, when the Navajo had been forcibly removed from their homeland and marched to an internment camp at Bosque Redondo in New Mexico. That original 1868 reservation was actually much smaller than the Navajo Nation today. Over the following decades, through a series of executive orders, the reservation was expanded again and again, eventually growing to be the largest Native American reservation in the country, stretching across parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. The Hopi situation moved on a separate track. In 1882, President Chester Arthur signed an executive order creating a reservation for the Hopi and, in the vague language of the era, quote, other such Indians as the Secretary of the Interior may see fit to settle thereon. That phrase would end up mattering enormously. The 1882 reservation was drawn as a rectangle, a little over 2 million acres, without much regard for how it related to the expanding Navajo territory around it. And critically, that vague language about other Indians the government might settle there left the door open for future ambiguity about who actually had rights within that rectangle. As the decades passed, the Navajo Nation kept growing outward through further executive orders and land expansions, and it grew in every direction around the Hopi rectangle. By the time the 20th century was underway, the Hopi Reservation had effectively become an island in the middle of a much larger territory that legally belonged to the Navajo Nation. This set up one of the strangest and most contentious land disputes in American history. Within that original 1882 Hopi Reservation rectangle, Navajo families had also been living for generations, especially in the outer portions, farther from the traditional Hopi villages clustered on the mesas in the center. As Navajo population grew and their herds expanded, more Navajo families settled within that rectangle. The Hopi, whose population was much smaller and whose villages were concentrated in the center of the reservation, watched Navajo presence expand around them, inside their own recognized boundary. For much of the early 20th century, this coexistence, uneasy as it was, continued without major federal intervention. But by the mid-1900s, tensions had built to a point where both nations were bringing formal legal claims against each other. The Hopi argued that the 1882 executive order had established the entire rectangle as their land, and that Navajo settlement within it was an encroachment. The Navajo argued that they had lived within and used much of that same land for generations, with the federal government's tacit acceptance, and that removing them now would be a profound injustice. In 1962, a federal court attempted to resolve this. It ruled that both tribes had rights to what became known as the Joint Use Area, a section of land within the old 1882 rectangle that surrounded the smaller area where the Hopi had exclusive rights. Sounds reasonable on paper. In practice, shared jurisdiction over the same land, with two different governments, two different legal systems, and two different cultural relationships to that land, created constant friction. Neither side was fully satisfied. Grazing rights, water access, and land use decisions became flashpoints again and again. This friction eventually pushed the dispute all the way to Congress. In 1974, lawmakers passed the Navajo-Hopi Land Settlement Act, which ordered the joint use area to be split between the two tribes based on land use patterns and formally partitioned. This sounds like a clean administrative fix. It was anything but. The partition meant that thousands of Navajo families who were living on land that was now designated as Hopi partition land had to relocate. Some Hopi families in areas that became Navajo partition land faced the same fate, though in far smaller numbers, since most Hopi families lived within the original reservation core. The relocation that followed is one of the most painful and least discussed chapters of 20th century Native American history. Beginning in the late 1970s and continuing through the 1980s and beyond, thousands of Navajo families were forced to leave land some of their families had lived on for generations. For many, this wasn't just a change of address. It meant leaving ancestral grazing land, family burial sites, and homes built with deep personal and spiritual connection to that specific place. Elderly members of the community in particular struggled profoundly with relocation, since Navajo traditional beliefs tie identity and well-being closely to specific land and its four sacred mountains. The relocation program was administered by a federal body, and it offered new housing and some compensation, but the process was widely criticized as slow, bureaucratic, and traumatic. Some families ended up in newly built communities that felt disconnected from the land-based, pastoral life they'd known. Studies conducted afterward pointed to serious impacts on mental health, community cohesion, and economic stability among relocated families. Even today, some Navajo families remain on Hopi partition land under special lease agreements, a legacy of a dispute that, despite decades of legal effort, has never been fully or comfortably resolved for everyone involved. So that's the historical machinery that carved out this strange geography, a Hopi homeland surrounded entirely by Navajo territory, a shape created not through mutual agreement, but through a tangle of executive orders, vague 19th century language, court rulings, and a congressional act that forced a wrenching human cost onto both communities, but especially the relocated Navajo families. What does this unusual geography actually mean for daily life today, though? For one thing, it means the Hopi Nation's relationship with the outside world runs, in a very literal sense, through Navajo land. Roads connecting Hopi villages to the rest of Arizona pass through Navajo territory. This creates layers of jurisdictional complexity that most people never have to think about. Law enforcement, road maintenance, utility access, and even simple things like where state and tribal authority begins and ends can become complicated when your entire border is shared with one other sovereign nation rather than open public land. It also shapes the two nations' relationship in ongoing, sometimes tense, ways. Land and water rights disputes haven't disappeared just because the 1974 partition happened. Both nations continue to negotiate. Access to water sources, particularly significant in a region where water scarcity affects agriculture, drinking water, and cultural practices tied to rainfall and springs. The Hopi, with their historic dry farming traditions, are especially sensitive to any disruption in water access, since their agricultural methods depend on very specific and limited water sources. There's also an economic dimension worth understanding. Because the Hopi Reservation is landlocked within Navajo territory, questions about infrastructure development, from telecommunications to energy projects, sometimes require cooperation or at least negotiation between the two governments in ways that wouldn't be necessary for a reservation with open borders. This has occasionally slowed development projects on the Hopi side, since access routes and utility corridors often need to cross Navajo land. At the same time, it would be a mistake to frame this purely as ongoing conflict. Many Hopi and Navajo communities today maintain everyday, functional, even friendly relationships, particularly at the personal and local level. Intermarriage between the two nations happens. Trade, both formal and informal, continues. Shared regional concerns, like environmental protection of the wider Colorado Plateau, sometimes bring the two governments to the same table with aligned interests rather than opposing ones. The relationship is layered, historical grievance sitting alongside daily practical cooperation. It's also worth noting how unusual this configuration is, not just within the United States, but really anywhere in the world. There are very few examples globally of one recognized, self-governing nation's territory being completely enclosed within another's, without any external border at all. It draws an interesting comparison, in miniature, to countries like Lesotho, which is entirely surrounded by South Africa, or San Marino, encircled entirely by Italy. Those are recognized sovereign states with international borders. The Hopi and Navajo nations don't have that level of formal international sovereignty, since both exist within the framework of the United States as federally recognized tribal nations. But the geographic and political parallel is striking. It shows that this kind of enclosed, landlocked sovereignty isn't unique to international borders. It can emerge from entirely domestic policy history too, shaped by the same forces of conquest, displacement, and bureaucratic decision-making that created some of those international enclaves. Understanding this geography also gives a clearer lens into a broader truth about Native American reservations generally. Reservation boundaries are rarely, if ever, simple reflections of where a people originated or how they lived before European and American contact. They are almost always the product of negotiation under duress, executive orders written with colonial assumptions, and decades of subsequent legal battles that reshaped the land again and again. The Hopi-Navajo situation is an extreme, visually striking example of this pattern, but it's really a magnified version of a story that played out, in different forms, across hundreds of tribal nations throughout American history. It's not a quirky cartographic coincidence. It's the visible trace of two peoples with deeply different histories and ways of life, caught in a slow-moving collision engineered largely by outside decisions that eventually forced thousands of families from their homes and left a geographic legacy that still shapes daily life, water rights negotiations, and the practical realities of governance in that part of Arizona today. It's a reminder that even something as seemingly neutral as a boundary line on a map can carry the weight of an entire, complicated, unresolved history within it.